G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic start to your week. Happy Monday. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over, but what we are going to be going over is something that you and I have been speaking about for a long time. This evolution of tactics on the front line that we have been seeing that is reflected in Russia's advancements and the war of attrition that we are seeing take place. And what we have seen take place over the past few days, but really come to the forefront today, is, as per I'm sure the title and thumbnail of this video, and anyone who's at least a neutral observer will be talking about this today. If people aren't talking about it, well, you know the basket we will put them in, is this large advancement of 10 kilometres, 6 miles that we have seen, the grey zone and some red move as well. And this is just an evolution on the hold, destroy, exploit, paint by numbers tactic that we have been seeing the Russians use, that you and I have been talking about for well over 12 months now, playing into that attritional phase of war and how we see those flanks, the holding with drones, destroy with heavier equipment, and then exploit the territory of that as a byproduct of that attrition. And this is merely a drone adapted old school way of maneuver position attrition that you may have heard of before. But there is a new element that has entered this in the past months, is the Russian DRG. Of course, a diversionary reconnaissance group. Likely you've heard reconnaissance sabotage group. Now, that can be a little bit misleading, the wording of that. We're going to go over how these smaller behind-the-lines teams are operating and accumulating forces and then helping on that destruction and exploitation that we are seeing take place, and how this all relates to warfare, because, of course, the battlefield will be reflected in politics. So we'll go over what Europe and Ukraine are saying. The battlefield doing this is the worst possible time. And then we'll go over, of course, the one who coined the term, war is politics by the means. And we'll go over in a bit of a lesson, I guess, almost in Karl von Clausewitz. I think that should be on the reading list for the coalition of the willing at this point in time. So, of course, legends, a lot today to go over. Of course, we'll be looking at maps and a little bit of extra stuff as well. So this is where we are going to start. We're going to zoom out on the maps. And of course, we have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. And if we come down here onto the hottest front line of Pokrovsk, what we can see today is to the northeast of Ransky, we can see a very large grey zone spire heading out towards Zoloty Kolodiaz. So let's measure this, and the minimum measurement is from here to here. Now, why are we saying that that is the minimum? Well, okay, the reason we use deep state map, although it is incorrect again and again and still not showing a lot of grey or red areas that we have geolocations now for months, but this is the accepted baseline from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. So if it is here, we know that at least to be a minimum. Now, is this red completely controlled Earth? No, I don't believe so. But we'll go through this strategy later on and how this works of up to 10 kilometres. You'll see a lot of people quoting more like 15 from here to here, but we're going off the minimum there. But this is still very major. If you'd like to have an idea of the relative speed of this, we haven't seen movements like this for a very long time, and the total ground in one direction made by the Ukrainian 23 counteroffensive around Robotny area was around this, or maybe just under. We typically say 8 to 10 kilometres. So this is a long way. But why does this threaten everything around it and this developing and evolving of new strategy and how the battlefield is? We'll be going over all of that today. So firstly, let's get a little bit of foundations going. We'll look over Google Earth of why this ground is very important as well. Now, Mr. Konrad Mazuka, replying to Mr. AMK Mapping on Twitter, says this: "It certainly wasn't a 48-hour development. We have had Russian DRGs operating in the area as early as 30 July. And let's say that 2 days ago, follow-on forces linked up with them." Okay, this is talking about Pokrovsk as a whole, creating a continuous forward presence that was later reported as a sudden breakthrough, but in reality was the culmination of over a week of infiltration and positional gains. In general, as I noted a few weeks ago, Ukrainian defensive lines increasingly appear to have lost cohesion. making further gains highly likely. And this is what I always say. My biggest lesson, as someone who I think I'm very well read in attritional warfare, is that this isn't a breakthrough. It is more of a collapse of the line and losing cohesion and thinning out of the lines rather than a breakthrough. A breakthrough is the byproduct of then the attritional nature of war, but not the number one goal. And the way to get there is vastly different. So a DRG, a diversionary reconnaissance group. Now, you'll often hear me refer to it as a sabotage reconnaissance group. And this isn't a great term in reflection of how they are operating and impacting the front line. Mr. John Helen says Russia is currently advancing by infiltration, pushing small groups of infantry through the porous Ukrainian front line. The function of these troops is not to reconnaissance or sabotage, although can be used in that way, but to eventually take and hold by basically accumulating enough manpower in Ukrainian depth. And you'll often hear me say, and then leveraging off that. And you can use this as diversionary as well, like we saw in Kursk and Sudzha. These guys got in behind, through that tunnel in behind the troops, create chaos there from a relatively small team. This is why I've been talking about Kupiansk. Now, this is oversimplified, but this is how the Russian tactics are currently working and working successfully for what we are seeing the warfare evolving and moving through these attritional protracted phases. And you'll often hear me refer to it as the paint by numbers. You'll hear other analysts call it the triple choke method. Now, this is very basics of it, is you build, hold, chaos, accumulate, destroy, exploit, and close. So you build on the flanks around an area, as we have seen. You then have your number one goal as attritional, not maneuver. Anything that does maneuver, if you introduce maneuver, if you introduce a breakthrough, you only want those as byproducts, not your number one goal, as the number one goal of attritional warfare is to have a positive balance in your way and then sow rot in the enemy the other way. So you build the flanks. You then hold in these areas. So you use fires. You use typically in this range drones to hold troops in, as well as impact then logistics and movement and rotation. You then have chaos and accumulation. DRGs have chaos, everything from increasing blue on blue incidents, increasing stress, and to be able to accumulate an amount of forces behind the line for a leverage point at some time. You then have this holding, building, and then you have the areas of destruction. You have then your more traditional forms of fires. You have artillery, both barrel and glide, and then once those have then taken place, you then have your TOS as a bit of a mop-up, those thermobaric systems. Now again, these don't exactly have to happen in order. There's a lot of overlap in these. Then you exploit this. You exploit the manpower problems and the porous front line, as Mr. John Helen would put it. And then the outcomes of this will be a withdrawal or collapse, and then you close that area with conventional forces, the byproduct then being territory gained or politics shifted. And it is as simple as maneuver position attrition, just more adapted for drones. And we see this in the overall doctrine of attritional warfare, that when you have offensive operations that's across a broad front and you're seeking to overwhelm the enemy at multiple points with shallow attacks, remaining inside a layered bubble of friendly protective systems, leverage drones, fires, while stretching depleted enemy reserves until the front line collapse. Porous, thin front line. Only then should the offensive extend towards objectives deeper in the enemy rear. So you're looking for the collapse, not breakthrough. Concentration of forces on one main effort should be avoided, as this gives an indication of the enemy's location and opportunity for the enemy to concentrate their reserves against this key point. So if you just put all in one area, then your enemy can put all in one area to push that back as well. So let's dive into how we are seeing then this bear fruits at the moment and what is happening on the front line. And we're then going to speak about how this is not at a great time. We know the meeting at the end of the week in Alaska, and how no matter how much you want to avoid the battlefield, at the end of the day, this will come to the forefront in negotiations. And we're going to speak back on Karl von Clausewitz too. So this is from Ukraine Control Map. Deep State show a large Russian breach all the way to Zoloty Kolodiaz, northeast of Pokrovsk, through numerous fortifications because, no surprise, Ukraine didn't man them. This is 15 kilometres from our last known geolocation, but we have little reason to doubt deep state as for the reasons I gave before. And this is what I've said. I have been very, very worried about these defensive lines that everyone put as this is where it will stop and this and that. I've said I've seen it time and time again. That's been said, and then just not be enough people in a defensive position. And all a defensive position is, if it's not manned, is a speed hump on the way and some wire to move. And then what have you gained? You have gained a fortified position for no effort of your own bloody engineers to build. And this, Dobropillia says, insufficient mobilisation in Ukraine equals war will be lost. And again, from Mr. Attackums here, I'll say, Zaluzny, love him or hate him, was correct when he said after the failed 23 offensive, we need 500,000 soldiers, and he eventually was pushed out for some disagreements. He was absolutely correct on this. The problem is everyone's saying we need mobilisation. Everyone now with a flag in their bio is talking about mobilisation and sending people back from Europe who have fled back to fight and all of this without willing to sign up themselves. But what I'll say is mobilisation, it does not happen overnight. It doesn't happen in weeks, and it doesn't even happen in a few months. To take someone from bare bones on the street to offensive operational capacity with experience takes 6 to 12 months at a minimum, and it's not a few. You need tens of thousands. It's very late to be speaking about this. So let's continue on this. Vitali, or at Monster, says this: solid fortifications, useless when there are too few to hold them. Deep State Ukraine released a map update and Playfair marked the lines. Sentinel delivered an image. The loss is significant-ish, but not to expect it. And you can see where this pushing is in these directions through fortification lines. You can see where the grey zone is pushed through this one, as well as where there are gaps in some of these lines too. And you can get then the Sentinel image of these major line. Now, before we go too much further, let's look at where exactly this is. So this is this Zolota Kolodiaz right here. And where you can see is where this grey zone has moved is up onto the high ground in this area as well by then the Google map. We are looking straight back south to Vilny and Rodansky at the moment. So this is very important. Now, high ground isn't as important back as maybe back in the days where you line up with your bloody muskets or your bow and arrows, but it is incredibly important when we're speaking about a war with the massive amount of radio transmissions, whether it is transmitting to drones, transmitting communications, or transmitting electronic warfare in dead spots as well. So let's continue on this as well. Playfair has a fantastic breakdown of all of this, and please go and follow everyone I show in this. Go send them some love as well as support these guys as needed. At Zoloty Kolodiaz, where we were just showing you on the maps, Russia had first contact with Ukraine's new Donbass line. First contact with this line. The DRGs broke through it for the first time, with the Ukrainians suffering from catastrophic manpower shortages. In a long term, this might endanger all of Ukrainian-controlled Donbass. A damage assessment and technical strategic overview of the situation. Now, we're not going to go through every slide here, but we'll go through most of them and how this is evolving too. Let's break down the confusion on what exactly causes these breakthroughs. I've identified 4 reasons. 1, something you and I have been raising the flag on for some time. Catastrophic manpower shortages in the Ukrainian ranks in this sector, initiating a loop of disorganised retreat, then Russian breakthrough, lengthening the front, manpower shortage, disorganised retreat. Of course, pushing on multiple sectors until somewhere collapses, but remaining in your bubble as per the doctrine, as per why I said Kursk would be fucking catastrophic, which we have seen, and lengthening the battlefield makes no sense if you are numerically inferior. In this specific case, we can name Kopteve, the settlement from which the Ukrainians retreated in terrible order in mid-June. From there, the Russians exploited a hole that formed in Razine behind the Kazany Torets River and continued without much resistance all the way until the doors of Rodyansky, where the time of writing they have been effectively stopped. So this moving through and what we have seen, moving, Rodyansky, Kopteve, and now he says effectively stopped, but building that flank and of course that holding of the amount of drones to the north of Pokrovsk, Minograd, and exploiting north where there are holes in lines. Not only holes in the physical lines, not enough men in them. Number 2, command incapacity. In the sector, Ukrainian command is reportedly living on another world. This is what happens when there is no accountability, because everything is, no matter what, trust the command here. We raised this issue years ago with Tataragami, and is very likely not giving orders or sending Ukrainian forces into hopeless counterattacks with no planning whatsoever. Being the Ukrainian and Russian military culture, one where tasks given from your higher-ups are viewed as extremely important, this makes you more dependent from your command and often exacerbates a bad leadership effect, which is a phenomenon which is very common to see in both sides. Again, what is exacerbated here is a lack of independent NCO corps to operate themselves, although we are seeing more of that entering as the war continues, as per we see how the Soviets would have operated under doctrine of, in the beginning, no, but that can buffer large losses of NCO, and then it grows like a pseudo NCO corps over time. Number 3, extremely large amount of Russian resources committed to this direction, with rumours talking of 100,000 troops just on the Pokrovsk sector. Most of these resources are currently attacking 24/7, which eventually exhausts the Ukrainian drone crews, forcing them to temporarily give in and give ground to the attacker. Notice how I replaced defenders with drone crews. Specifically, there is simply nobody in the positions. And of course, this is all exacerbated through this choking method, this exploitation method of the flanks, the logistics, but as well of attrition overall. 4, new Russian tactics. For about a month now, the Russians have been massively increasing DRG usage. So it's an evolution of tactic, not new. I agree with Playfair here. I'm nitpicking language. I'm nitpicking my own language, because we have seen that this paint by numbers is the same, but it's really slipped in this DRG usage. Now, everyone loves to say these troops going on motorcycles or scooters or by foot is ridiculous, but look at what we're seeing then become. These are very small groups of 2 or 3 people are sent along a very well-planned route with the hopes of simply bypassing Ukrainian positions, which do not constitute a line, but rather bubbles on a map because the resource and personnel shortage, porous front line, and use accumulation of force, getting in their rear and sowing as much chaos as possible, harassing logistics, and something that is very often overlooked, but is the number one reason of many Russian breakthroughs recently, distracting Ukrainian UAV crews from the front and Russian pilots, which in turn get total operational freedom and can suppress Ukrainian bubbles easily. These small DRG groups are almost always noticed on approach to the point of deployment, the accumulation point, and they hit in both that phase and when moving from the point of deployment to their objective. We do hear about high casualties on these. Again, you know how I feel about any numbers, but what we are seeing is, what are we seeing? We are seeing this turn into advancements. I know everyone's title is completely destroyed, blah, 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 but what are we seeing? We are seeing it turned into advancement and operationally strategically important advancement on the battlefield. Even if these efforts render DRG troops' survival chance very low, the sheer amount of forces committed that we're talking about give considerable results, like in the center of Pokrovsk. Now, 3 days ago, there was an article stating there are no Russian DRG elements in Pokrovsk. I tell you, I would not be very confident in that with a lot of the footage that we are seeing further. Now, for the damage assessment. Russian forces consolidated positions over the line 0.5 at Hektabalka, consisting of 1 barbed wire, 1 anti-tank niche, and 1 dragon's teeth. 2. The zone of combat activity was expanded much further around the salient because of DRG activity, which is not visible on a map. This will further worsen Ukrainian organisation and logistics and distract resources. 3. Russians opened Dobropillia front, with reports of DRGs at its doors. Go over that in a sec. More importantly, the Russians are seriously attempting, and according to Deep State, succeeded to cross the obstacle part of the new Donbass line, as you can see right here. This not only means that the only defensive line before central Ukraine is being fought over already, but also endangers all of Ukrainian-controlled Donbass in the long term. And we know what lies beyond there is much, much more open and much more thin. And what we do know is that Russia are accumulating massive amounts of armoured resource in their manufacturing plants, and still no clear idea of what that's going to be used for. Some are saying If then we did see a breakthrough, again, I am still not leaning there yet with the nature of war and drones, but maybe we will. And this movement and to Dobropillia and threatening this whole area and where these supply runs into Dobropillia as well. Let's continue. About point 4, which to me is the most worrying, the lines. A year plus or minus 4 months, in my opinion, to reach what's in the picture. A possible breakthrough at Zoloti Kolodiaz, as we showed you, opens the opportunity you see down below. In white, fortified areas and large urban agglomerations. In red, the possible course of actions that I think Russia will take on its way to their first political goal, the capture of the Donbass. And we will see how war influences politics. And I don't give a shit what Ursula von der Leyen is up there saying, because history is on our side, doctrine is on our side, and your own excuses are on your side, because if you didn't want Ukraine to be in a position of power on the battlefield, which you do want, so you can influence politics. 9. In fact, you have to remember that the Russians' first objective is not the hundreds of kilometres of fields in Zaporizhia or Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, but the capture of the Donbass, which is constituted by the Donetsk and Luhansk fronts. This makes it's very obvious with what is being suggested at the moment to Washington for the Alaska trip is we'll pause the front lines here, but we're taking all the Donbass. If the Luhansk Luhansk Oblast is under their control of about 99%, the Russians still struggle with Donetsk Oblast at 60%-ish because of the effective and organised Ukrainian units and command and adequate fortifications. So focusing on Donetsk, what's still missing after 4 years of war are Konstantinivka, Druskivka, then Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, the largest areas in here. The Kramatorsk being de facto capital of Ukrainian-controlled Donbass. These cities are giant for this war standards and are absolutely impossible to take frontally, even from two sides, as we have spoken about this movement through from Siversk as well. Look on the map in a second. This is what we are seeing up here. If you remember, the Russians understood this problem extremely well since 22. And tried to open on the third or fourth side in 22. The Russian-controlled Liman Izium being the large logistical hubs that seriously threatened Sloviansk. But in September 22, the Ukrainians thwarted this with their successful counter-offensive. Obviously, Liman Izium Pinsa would require crossing the Seversky Donetsk River, which a drone war is absolutely suicidal. Now, Seversky Donetsk River, we talk about these areas and the importance of the supply, though, down into Donetsk for water. But this does not mean the Russians won't turn Svatovsk and Studansk into a large drone hubs on their way to Izium-Sloviansk highway, located only 5 kilometres from there. Nothing for today's drone standards. And this is something you and I have been speaking about a long time. This Liman Turney front line we've been speaking of, which you can see today is moving. Keep an eye on what is occurring here in this building of a flank. But let's continue down on this sector that we have seen this movement today. Going back to Dobropillia, many people noticed a certain hole in the defences in this area. As you can see, it is very convenient for the Russians, situated not only right on the tactical heights between city and Zoloti Kolodiaz, but a railway line also runs right through it, which always served as an infantry highway for Russian forces. That would mean if this breakthrough were to be stopped, this threat still remains, and the front already way too close for comfortable digging, meaning the Ukrainians have to close this gap fast. At the moment, there is progress, but at this pace of Russian advances, it will not be fast enough. If there will be consolidation near Zoloty, I expect construction there to halt completely for safety reasons for the workers, and this adds another threat, as if it weren't enough already. And this is what you're trying to do, is create this fall and fall and fall with the attritional nature at some point in war. Now, have we crossed that at this point? I don't believe so, but we are definitely seeing that event horizon and that bankruptcy. You're down to final chips on the table at a time when everyone's showing their cards at the table in Alaska. So we can see this is the deep state Dobropillia, Vodianske area that he's speaking of here in general. I think the Russians will make attempts to attack Dobropillia and Bilozersky from the east, if not to create a pincer from the northern side of the two cities. But if they will encounter resistance, they will have to stop, because taking on such a challenge is hard no matter what army you have with such an exposed salient. So the threat of being cut off, vertically enveloped. Rather, I think they'll try to advance north and south of Dobropillia to wedge between it and Bilozerske, while using their railway to the advantage to create a northern pincer of Bilozerske. Further south, it seems logical. Since they encountered resistance at Rodianske to attack Bieletsky from the north, they descended all the way to Attrition, the last retreat route for Pokrovsk, Minograd. About the northern part, my predictions are in the posts above, and you can see this movement down Vodianske, Shevchenko area, and Pokrovsk, Minograd, and where the final ways out of here are, and this hooking around that is currently occurring that may actually be worse than what we are looking at on here. In conclusion, dear viewers, please do not sugarcoat this situation. It is bad, very bad. This is one of the lowest places Ukraine has been since 24 in terms of possible territorial loss and opportunities ceded to the Russians. But Ukraine and Russia are in further areas of power and disparity on the battlefield than they were in 24. Russia's tactics have improved dramatically, and Ukraine's ability to counter this has then deteriorated, as we see by the kilometre squares and the further envelopments and the pushing on multiple sectors too. Russia is in a better situation on the front than they were back then. After the Prohez catastrophe, which though did not menace whole cities, regarding the fact infantry is needed to man the defences, I'd like to reiterate that these obstacles were built with manpower shortage in mind and require drone operators to patrol, with the final aim of not letting the Russians over the obstacles and, as such, not needing infantry for contact battles. Again, what have I been preaching? There's an over-reliance on drones. But don't get me wrong, infantry is still king of the battlefield. No matter what anybody says, control is not control if there is nobody there. It is as simple as that. Nothing can seize or hold and exploit like infantry. My personal opinion is that the Ukrainians will have to make a strong decision very soon, and of a very large calibre, to patch up further holes. Available resources are clearly not enough to cover all of the front effectively. And a lot of the people I'm seeing at the moment are saying there needs to be a withdrawal of the resource and assets in Pokrovsk and Minograd to stop this. Because yes, this threatens losing two very important strategic hubs, but this threatens a wedge between Dobropillia, Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, Bilozerske, and a movement into those open fields through the lines as well. And this is why I've said areas like this remain open, because resources keep getting pushed into it. I have no doubt that Russia could allocate the resources needed on this front line up in here to push from Kharkivka to the Oskil. Why have I said that there's no further push to the west, but an expansion of control here? Because there's an area to keep open like this, and that attrition is the primary goal, with the byproduct being the then exploitation and gaining ground following this. Let's have a look at a couple of maps and see what is going on. So we have this, Suryak is talking about this movement on the eastern side and that push up, but he's not showing even as far as the grey zone is on that. Of course, he's talking in Pokrovsk itself as well, where we have seen DRG elements moving all throughout, saying that they are increasing their ground really into Persho Travnevi, pushing into the outskirts of the city. But what concerns me was the earliest person I saw talking about this was Mr. AMK Mapping. I'm stoked that he is finally, after wading through all the bullshit of people coming at him, is getting the recognition that he deserves for his work. He has recently released this. You can go and follow him at these links here. It is rumoured that Russia's breakthrough east of Dobropillia has bloomed further, with Russian forces now are capturing the villages of Novoshakhove, Novaya Donbass, and Vilna. Okay, so with capture, let's zoom in a little bit. You know that I struggle sometimes with the labeling on this map. So Vilna, Novoshakhove, and Zoloty Kola Diaz, with, he says, capturing, okay, put a pen in it, okay, but you can see his map in here. But again, this is just rumoured, okay, and entering the villages of Zoloty Kola Diaz, entering this area, I was slightly wrong on that. Then, as well as, we see Rubezhane right up in here, entering, and then we see, and areas like Kusherev Yar that we see right here. So that's further bloomed. It's also reported Ukrainian forces moved back to northern Volodymyrivka after the Russians failed to consolidate there. If these reports are true, that would put the Russian 3.4 kilometres from Dobropillia Kramatorsk highway, the highway I've spoken about that runs right from Dobropillia, Kramatorsk, very important for both of these sectors. And we can see this front line at the moment is happening at not a fantastic time. But we see that this doesn't tend to be influencing the rhetoric coming out of Ukraine and the EU. So we see this statement here from France, Italy, Germany, Poland, UK, von der Leyen, and Stubbs, Finland. We see this coming out. Now, finally, I've heard something about the coalition of the willing upholding, imposing restrictive measures against the Russian Federation. So these sanctions still in place. We share conviction. The diplomatic solution must protect Ukraine and Europe's vital security interests. Ukrainians effectively defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity, that Ukraine has a freedom of choice over its own destiny. Professor Mearsheimer would be having a fit reading over that about power of great power politics. Meaningful negotiations can only take place in the context of ceasefire and reduction of hostilities. The path to peace for Ukraine cannot be decided without Ukraine. Remain committed to the principle that international borders must not be changed by force. So international borders, territorial integrity, the case at the moment. The current front line of contact should be the starting point of negotiations. We're united as Europeans and determined to jointly promote our interests. Okay. But so this is what I'm getting out of this. Full NATO entry, the ability to do what you'd like, security interest, okay. No territorial actual shifts, a starting point of which is not a fair battlefield at the moment. No sanctions relief coming. What I would ask is, well, what is then actually being discussed? Because that isn't the reflection of the battlefield at this point in time. And will we see Putin know you are going to do this and that this all in Alaska is a political show, poison pill to get to the US to walk away? J.D. Vance said very similar today about we don't want to continue funding this and taxpayers don't want either. But there is a factor in which I have overlooked, although we have mentioned it before. In wartime, a government ultimately has to bow to the will of the people and the military. Regardless of how authoritarian it is, at the end of the day, you still bow to that. And we have discussed how regardless of Kyiv's position, and if they accept something or not, some soldiers may choose to keep fighting. What will happen if that does? We've spoken at length about that. But Ukraine is facing and has faced a silent but significant desertion problem in the tens of thousands, potentially in the hundreds of thousands. And could there be an opposite? Could there come a point where instead of signing something and people refusing to stop fighting, you refuse to sign something and a large segment of your population, both civ and military, they decide that no, accepting a deal and returning to peace is worth a loss of territory and ultimately the survival of a state, even if Kyiv disagrees here. So again, could you see that people go, if Zelensky shoots this down, and then go, that's actually something that we may have wanted? Because we have seen through internal polls the idea of concessions being more and more popular over the length of the war. And again, could we see this then further spiral as well? But I said that this is a bad time for all of this to be happening because war is politics by other means. And as Karl von Clausewitz said here, the original Giga Chad, that war is merely continuation of policy by other means. And we're going to go over some of his parts from On War and how war is still incredibly relevant to this. There's new weapons, there's new men, there's new tactics, there's new doctrine. But the reason war is fought is still the same, whether it is with a stick, a stone, or a fibre optic drone. The stronger will dictate the terms. The aim of war is to disarm the enemy and render him politically helpless. 3, political objectives and military means are inseparable. The political object will determine both the military objective to be reached and the amount of effort it requires. 4, the aim is to break the enemy's ability to resist. The fighting force must be destroyed. That is, put in such a condition that it can no longer carry on this fight. 5, war tends toward absolute. when neither side will yield. So if neither side's going to stop, if one side will not yield, the effort will increase until one side is overthrown to an absolute end. Negotiations codify battlefield reality, not replace it. The result in war is never final, but the immediate result is in the hands of the victor. And much like Big Surge would say, that the sword predates and transcends the pen, which is correct. But I'll go a step further, adding this Clausewitzian idea that the pen, it only comes into play after the sword has carved out the facts on the ground. And that is being carved out at this point in time. And this in here, what it could become, could absolutely impact that significantly more than we are seeing. We're going to go a step further on Clausewitz's On War. Now, if you have a strong base in some political education knowledge, great, read this. If not, and a lot of people, including myself, probably better to pick up someone who's a professor or a military analyst of Clausewitz and actually break it down into the more simplified ideas as well, because it reads like the era that it was. But let's go over a couple of parts in this. If we do not accustom ourselves to look upon war and the single campaigns in a war as a chain, which is all composed of battles strung together, one of which always brings on another, if we adopt the idea that the taking of certain geographical point, the occupation of an undefended province, is in itself anything, then we are likely to regard it as an acquisition which we might not retain. Now, in this is where we speak about, you'll hear me put it simply, war is like an organism, that it's not a series of individual events. You can come down to tactics as that, but a war is itself organisms. You push here, you'll pull there. Now let's skip forward a little bit more into some relevant parts more for today on page 310. Lost ground and want of fresh reserves are therefore usually the principal causes which determine a retreat. Very relevant for today. But at the same time, we by no means exclude or desire to throw in shade of other reasons, which may lie in the interdependence of parts of the army in a general plan. Further, the spirit of the mass is broken. The original excitement about losing or winning, through which danger was forgotten, is spent. And to the majority, danger now appears no longer an appeal to their courage, but rather the endurance of a cruel punishment. Thus, the instrument in the first moment of the enemy's victory is weakened and blunted, and therefore no longer fit to repay danger by danger. Two more. No battle is decided in a single moment, although in every battle there is an arise of moments of crisis on which the results depend. The loss of a battle is therefore a gradual falling of the state. Often in combats which are beyond restoration of new forces are sacrificed in vain, often through neglect, decision has not been seized when it might easily have been secured. As we said, that if you send men into a war that is unwinnable, you forgo being a commander and start becoming their executioner. In one word, the art of war, in its highest point of view, is policy, but no doubt, a policy which fights battles instead of writing notes. And this is perfect of that war is politics by other means. That the art of war is in its highest point of view policy. It's to impact policy, that Russia is launching a war to impact policy of not joining NATO and take areas of which they will. And when it can't be done through the pen, it goes back to a more blunt force, older form of bullet, machine, and man, and which fights battles instead of writing notes. And this is the policy which these European leaders have forgotten. A policy in which fights battles instead of writing notes, which to be a leader of a European state, and those that not only developed all of this, but have fought these wars over centuries. I can't believe there's not an understanding of how and why Russia is committing in a war like this. Now, that doesn't mean it's just or right or moral or ethic. It doesn't mean in any of that. But you need an understanding of why war is bad. And if you boil this down to he's a crazy dictator sitting in the Kremlin and this is nothing more than to throw men into something, you don't understand the reasons for which a country whose history is bathed in blood and war and large victory, and initial catastrophic loss and following through victory and being able to absorb large loss is inexcusable. Now let's have a look at the remainder of the maps. I've already showed you some areas, but we'll come down to the Lika, Novosilka area, and we'll bring up the Suryak maps in this front. And during the last 4 days, the Russian army continued advancing towards this Komishuvka and entered the first houses of Yanvarske. So let's have a look at Yanvarske right here. There's grey zone moving out there. That's where he's saying, and more movement just to the south out of Shevchenko too. Will come up in Toretsk, an area where we do believe there's been a lot of movement, and potentially there are some saying that this is now completely cut off in here. We'll wait out on that. We see then that's more movement in Katerinivkia area by the Russians. We saw armoured assaults heading into there the other day come into Sever's northern front, this Yampil area, Slovyansk Liman that we spoke about before, this building of that flank, an area which is very, very critical. We see in the Kremenske forest during the last 48 hours, Russian army continued advancing instead of Bianca forest and captured a series of trenches and the Kamyanska electrical station. So you're saying further exploitation. What we do know is there is definitely ground here. So this is showing ground. We saw the ground made the other day. There's definitely advancements on these sectors. And there's a video here, which many, many people have sent me. God, that's loud, sorry. Of this is a Russian Geran drone. We can see with a live feed heading off it. But what we're most interested by is this is dropping cassettes of mine. You can see the cassettes under here, and then we see it flying then over roads, and you can see these dropping these mines as well, which of course create a massive problem. And speaking on mines, this is something that these troops, these DRGs that have headed 10 kilometers at a minimum behind into these areas, where are the minefields? Where is all of this that has been able to move through, potentially accumulate, potentially leverage, exploit? Maneuver, attrition, position. And the maneuver, we're not talking about maneuver armoured warfare, but we're meaning maneuver of that, gain position through attrition. Legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day. I wanted to get ahead on the 8 ball on this, and I think we're going to start seeing a lot more people then referring to the, call it the Willys paint by numbers of tactics that we have seen. I think more, this is going to become more and more obvious and inignorable for a lot of analysts and bloggers, etc. Have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.